So in contrast to the Republic, Aristotle argues for the necessity of the family, arguing that it is the first community in which humans come together, man and woman coming together for the necessity of having children and dealing with the regular needs of life, food, shelter, clothing, companionship. As the old prayer book puts it, mutual help and society. The family is the cell of the state, the nucleus from which the higher forms of association come, the place where affections are nurtured and character is formed. Every other association is either part of the family, like the parent-child relationship, the master-servant relationship, which is more or less an employee-employer relationship, since all households in the ancient world were small businesses. Right? Every other association is either part of the family or is formed through the association of families together into clans, villages, etc. So instead of being an obstacle to a just community, the family is essential to it as the nursery of life and of virtue. This crucial civic and political understanding of the family that is articulated by Aristotle in Book 1 of the Politics became the mainstream of Western thought. It's far more compatible with the Hebraic and Christian revelation. You can find this idea right down to the American founding, in the framers of the Constitution, in de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and in many other places. Okay. Now, fortunately for those who are rooting for the partnership side of the argument, this apparent division between our figures is more apparent than real. I won't take up all your time now, but if you read my book, you'll see copious evidence that the Republic is not Plato's last word on the family. In his final work, The Laws, he maintains that families are important for the cultivation of virtue and absolutely necessary for cities in this fallen world. The utopia of the Republic was to make a point, not to have the last word. In that final work that Plato wrote, The Laws, he makes it clear that the purpose of marriage and sex is the procreation of a godly seed, or at least almost that. He says the sexual union is, quote, in accordance with nature for the production of children. When young men and women come of age, they should get married and live in their own households. He writes that they, and this is a quote again, right, should leave their own homes, free for their mothers and fathers, and establish a little colony of their own. There they can live with an eye on their parents and their parents' eyes on them, fathering and bringing up children, passing on the torch of life, as it were, from generation to generation, with constant attention to the gods as the law demands, end quote. That, I would submit, is the final word on Plato's view of the family. At the end of the day, I actually think Aristotle learned his arguments about the family from Plato, although I can't demonstrate that. All right, at an intellectual level then, I think we should think of Plato and Aristotle as partners, not enemies. Partners in pressing forward the priority of virtue in human life, of a metaphysics against materialism in favor of spiritual realities. And this is in contrast to all the main alternatives on the field, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Skeptics, and the Sophists. All right, one more point of conflict I want to address. Their personal relationship to each other is a bit more ambiguous. Okay. We all know, you're probably familiar with the fact that Aristotle was a student of Plato. He studied with Plato at Plato's Academy. One testimony from Diogenes Laertius in the 200s AD, so later, says that Aristotle studied there for 20 years, from ages 17 to 37. Right? So imagine moving here at 17 and staying for 20 years. Right? It was that long of a thing. Aristotle was from Macedonia in the north. Right? He moved down to Athens to go to school. However, Diogenes Laertius also says he left the academy after 20 years while Plato was still alive. So he left while Plato was still alive. Probably not very much before his death. He doesn't say why he left, though. He leaves that as like a tantalizing, the why question's not answered. What would have led to that? Why would you leave a place after 20 years? Well, we do know that when Plato died, not long after that, in 347 BC, Aristotle did not become head of Plato's academy. Plato's nephew Speusippus did. At that time, Aristotle was still in his 30s. Speusippus would have been in his 60s, a more appropriate age for a scholiarch. Being a relative of Plato's, it was likely the academy was property owned by Plato. He owned an estate on the edge of the academy. It probably passed to his nephew Speusippus. So along with control of the property, probably passed control of the school. The scholar Robin Waterfield also notes that Speusippus, there's evidence he was more involved in the mathematical work of the academy, something Aristotle didn't show much deep interest in. In any case, Aristotle does not become head of the school and instead travels to Artaneus in Asia Minor, staying there for several years. Was he disappointed that he didn't become head of the academy? That he was passed over in favor of Plato's nephew Speusippus? We don't know. If he's already left the academy, it probably wasn't any surprise that he didn't take over. Usually when you leave something, you don't take it over a couple years later. It's not that common. So we don't really know. Perhaps he saw the split coming and he tried to get out ahead of it. In any case, he ends up starting his own rival school at the Lyceum, but not right away after Plato's death. So after Plato dies, he stays away for 3 years. This is according to Diogenes Laertius again. And then returns to Athens, but doesn't start a school right away. He leaves again to go back up to Macedonia, his homeland in the north, where he serves in Philip's court and tutors Alexander the Great. That's another story you might have heard of about Aristotle. He does eventually return to Athens. And when he comes back, he doesn't rejoin the academy. Instead, he founds his own training institute at a different gymnasium, the Lyceum, which is on the other side of town. His school is, of course, successful and is taken over by his student Theophrastus after his death, although it is not as successful as the academy, since some version of the academy survives for nearly 1,000 years until Justinian withdraws public funding for the philosophers in 529 AD, many hundreds of years later. There are hiatuses in there for various reasons. If they were partners then, it seems that they were partners that by the end had trouble working together, to the point that Aristotle left and founded a separate school. Okay, lessons for the 21st century. I promised a few lessons, so here they are. There's a range of things we could say. I just have 3 very practical things. First, people might get along better than you think, better than it looks from the outside. You might think 2 people should fight with each other, but in reality, they get along great. We might think 2 views are radically opposed, but when we step back, we might see they're actually quite similar and united against a broader enemy. Don't make things worse than they are, and don't make them out to be worse than they actually are. Second, Jesus said, "He who is not against us is for us." He also said, "He who is not with me is against me." So you have to take both of those things. But if someone's not attacking you, don't automatically assume they want to or are going to. Though, of course, be wise as serpents. If they're out there doing their thing and it's not quite your thing, then just let them. God may be using them for good in some way you can't see, in some way that ends up really helping you in the end. Remember, Aslan is on the move. The game is afoot. He has friends and subjects everywhere, and bigger powers than you and I are at work in the world. And so the outcome is not in our hands. Right? Plato and Aristotle had no idea what would happen in the future when they were doing their thing. People that look like enemies at first might turn out to be world-shattering friends. I think J.R.R. Tolkien is a master at understanding this dynamic in his Lord of the Rings series. There's lots of examples of this that happen throughout that trilogy. So leave people be and have faith in help coming from God's power. Now, if people are out there calling you satanic, saying you have a dark and non-Christian view of who God is and have the spirit of Antichrist, that's someone who's against you. If they deny that the damned suffer eternal torment in hell, or deny that bodies will rise again, that's someone who's against you. Aslan's not moving there. But if they're out there doing their thing, leaving you alone, go and do likewise. Don't blast the other farmer for doing things differently when you're both working on producing food for the flock. Okay. Third, even when we are substantively partners with someone, we might still have practical problems working together. Presbyterians and Baptists are partners in the gospel, but they have a few practical problems working together in the same denomination. Sometimes you have to amicably divide and conquer. Okay, consider the story of Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark in Acts 13 and 15. You're probably familiar with this story. You'll remember how John Mark left Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13, went back to Jerusalem, declining to continue on their journey with them. And then 2 chapters later in Acts 15, Barnabas wants to bring John Mark along again, but Paul is against it because of how he abandoned them a while back. Scripture says the contention between them was sharp. They had sharp contention. It got intense because a lot was at stake. But in the end, they couldn't see any way to proceed together. And so they decide to go their own ways. Barnabas takes John Mark, Paul takes Silas. Did one of them repudiate the gospel? Did one of them sin? Are they now enemies? I don't think so. They have to go their separate ways. From all we can tell, they did so with each other's blessings, but we don't know. It might have been sharp to the end. They might have left bitter and had to reconcile later in some way, or maybe it was left to the end, unfortunately. It's a terrible circumstance if that happens. But sometimes you do have to have separate institutions, separate schools, the academy and the lyceum, even when we're all part of the same mission. All right. To conclude, think again about Raphael's School of Athens. Pull up that image of the philosophers in your mind. Consider again the central figures. The two I would recommend to you are friends. They're standing side by side, right next to each other. Where are they looking? They're even looking toward one another. And their faces are not in conflict, they're in conversation. They each contribute their own gift, their own distinctiveness to the story, and together they birthed a powerful intellectual heritage that, when properly transformed and sanctified, helps to form Christian thinking in the West.